How's everyone doing tonight? All right. My name is Victor Simmons, Jr. I am the library administrator here at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American Culture and History. And I want to thank Acapella Books for helping bring this program to you all. I want to thank, of course, Tiffany D. Cross, as well as Michael Harriot for being here tonight. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here and also for your continued support of the Auburn Avenue Research Library. So, without further ado, I'll begin with the introductions. Tiffany D. Cross most recently hosted the Cross Connection on MSNBC. She is the author of Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy, and previously served as a resident fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. Sorry, I left my glasses at home. Her broad experience across media, politics, and policy includes more than 2 decades of navigating newsrooms and campaigns while engaging different constituencies on the ground. She is a former DC borough chief of BET News and cut her teeth in media at CNN, where she worked as an associate producer covering Capitol Hill for the network's weekend show unit. She also previously served as a field producer for America's Most Wanted and Discovery Communications. Let's welcome Tiffany D. Cross. All right, so now let me introduce the person who we're here to see, even though Ms. Cross is wonderful. She wants green M&Ms. Next time I know better. Michael Harriot is a columnist at thegrio.com, where he covers the intersection of race, politics, and culture. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and NBC, BET, and on his mother's refrigerator. He is a political commentator on MSNBC and CNN and has been honored by the National Association of Black Journalists for commentary, digital commentary, and TV news writing. Michael is the creator and co-host of the podcast Drapetomaniax, Unshackled History, produced in partnership with Pharrell's OTHERtone. His college course, Race and Economic Construct, was adapted by university economics departments across the country as a model for teaching the combination of history, economics, politics, and class structures. Now let's give a warm round of applause for Michael Harriot. Enjoy the program.
Woo. Hi, everybody. Like you all, I'm a huge Michael Harriot fan, so I have to say I've been looking forward to this for weeks now. So thank you, Mr. Harriot, for having me here with you today.
Thank you for coming. I'm a huge Tiffany Cross fan.
So Michael and I, in full disclosure, saw each other last week in DC because he had a book event there, and I had just started his book and could not put it down. So for all of you all who just bought it, you are in for a treat. It is witty and hilarious and enraging and all the things. Black AF history. For our seniors in the audience, AF stands for always fruitful. So, Mr. Harriot, I have to say, in reading this book, when I wrote my book, the common question I had was, who did you write this book for? And that was the guidance I got. Like, when you're writing, write this book for someone or to someone. Who did you write this book for?
I think I wrote it for who I write for all of the time. So, have you ever been in a room or in a place, period, and someone said, like, did you feel that or did you hear that? And you think you might be going crazy because, well, to me, living in America, if you're black, is like that all the time. And so I don't envision myself or imagine myself as a voice for black people, but I am writing for black people. Not necessarily exclusively to them, but I want them to know when they read me, oh, I wasn't crazy. I wasn't losing my fucking mind. Like, that thing that I feel or see or think or worry about or think about, somebody else thinks about it too. And they think about it enough to write about it and explain it in a way that other people can understand it.
Yeah. Well, I have to say you do such a beautiful job of that, always in your writing, in your Twitter threads, but even in your columns that you write. Some people, I think they can write and be rather pedantic in their style. I truly feel like when I'm reading you, I'm having a conversation with you. And in this book, there's so much history. I felt like I was a pretty well-read person. There was so much history I did not know. In writing this, there are times that you write about things that bring tears to my eyes. I'm outraged by them. I am enraged by them. I'm saddened by them. Yet you write about it with such wit and humor in some areas. Describe to me the balance in trying to do that, because I imagine that you've had to be angry at some of the things that you describe.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of it is like you kind of develop, not necessarily a callus, because sometimes I write about stuff and think about stuff, and I'll tear up when I'm writing it, or sometimes when I read it back. But I think that how we relate to each other, how we talk to each other is like that, how black people talk to each other. And like Damon Young says, you don't have to inject humor, you just gotta not remove it. So, we'll be at a funeral, and it'll be, your aunt, and you'll be on the back row like, oh my God, your cousin will be like, I can't believe my mama wore that hat, right? Like, so that's how we relate to each other. And again, right, if black people were enraged by the history and the circumstances of being in America, like we wouldn't have any humor, because it is constantly, there's always something to be enraged and angry and upset and teared up by. So we have to find a way to fit that in, and I think that's where that humor comes from.
It's really we're self-medicating.
Right.
In those moments. I want to revisit, because when you say you wrote this book for black people, so often I think that is our position. Other people are welcome to get something out of it, but my intended audience was for black people. But if you are not a member of our diaspora, what is something that someone outside of the black community might get out of this book? I have an idea, but I'm curious your thoughts.
So one of the things I think when you say you write for black people, a lot of times I write stuff that every black person knows inherently, right? But sometimes it's good to see it in writing where white people can read it. So there's a lot of this stuff in this book that black people have heard about, right? Like for a couple of years ago when everyone was talking about Tulsa and Black Wall Street, like black people generally knew about it. Like it was so ubiquitous in our community, there was a rap label called Black Wall Street, right? But when you see it in writing and included in the larger culture, I think that's important. And then the other thing is, I wanted to show white people what it's like when we read history. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, right, like there's a lot, I say white people a lot in this book, but there's a reason behind it, and I explain it in the book. But when I went to social studies class, for instance, they would talk about the French and the English settlers and the Pilgrims, and then the Native Americans, and then the African slaves. And if you listen to that sentence that I just said, right, the British and the French people, they had a country and with boundaries and politics and a chosen king and all of that. That's all implied when you say British and French, and you give them a history and a name for their country and everything else. And then when you say Native American, you just lump them into an amorphous thing, right? Even if, and that's if you say Native American. Sometimes it's Indian, right? And when you say Africans, or slaves or enslaved people, you take away their history, their political motivation, their background, their culture, their identity, and that's how we learn history, right? Even the idea, for instance, of discovering America. So we know scientifically that people had come to America from what we call the Australian continent already. Africans had been there and been here. Asians had crossed through the Bering Strait. And so the idea of white people discovering America, or Christopher Columbus, or whoever we associate, is like they were the last people here. And we start talking about it from the date that white people got here, which is how we learn history. Like just the idea of who discovered America is seen through, when we talk about critical race theory, and what critical race theory really is not just, people describe it as talking about history or law through a racial lens, but it's not really a racial lens. It's a racial lens other than whiteness, because white people are a race, and we learn history through a racial lens. We learn history, the discovery of America is a white lens. The idea that they were French colonizers and not land thieves is a white lens, right? Like the idea that the Japanese invaded America and white people settled or colonized America is a white lens, right? So when I say what white people can learn, they can learn that by just seeing that same construct that they use, right? Right, where you strip away some people's background and include the background of others. By reading that on its reverse, you kind of you learn how you've been learning, not just the facts that I'm talking about, but you get to see how everybody else learns history, and how, when we talk about what they call critical race theory and how it makes white children feel bad, how do you think the black children were feeling learning that, through that lens?
So there is a passage very early on in the book that I thought was kind of the thesis. It summed up. So when I asked what can people outside of this diaspora learn, and specifically white people in this country, because some of them are victims of this same system, I think that was one of the lenses they looked at in South Africa when you're trying to have racial equity. You are responsible for your own knowledge and learning. This book is written like a textbook. It's necessary. Very early on, I can read this unless you would like to read it.
No, you can.
Okay. This is a passage very early on that I think many of us in this room understand, and some of us may not. He begins with, "The story of America is fantastical, overwrought and fictive tale. It is a fantasy where Christopher Columbus discovered a land that he never set foot in. It is George Washington's cherry tree and Abraham Lincoln's log cabin. It is the story of slaves who spontaneously teleported themselves here with nothing but strong backs and a brainful of Negro spirituals. It is Betsy Ross's sewing kit and Paul Revere's horse and Tom Jefferson's pen and Benjamin Franklin's eyeglasses and George Washington's teeth and liberty and justice for all. And it is a history predicated on lies." When I read this passage, I looked for the collection plates. I was worshiping at your altar, my brother. I cannot tell you, because of course we all know that is BS. Of course we all knew that. There are so many people in this country, at least 75 million, who are happy to elect a white supremacist to the Oval Office, who believe in this mythology. And for us, that's kind of like you believe Jack and the Beanstalk is a true story. The same way this comes across. You wrote this book at a time where books are being banned all across the country, which is also another strange phenomenon, because why do you want your kids to be dumber than mine, What kind of reception do you think that this book will get at this time? Because this could be helpful, where it's like, everybody go out and read this book. If it's controversy, people are like, we're banning this book. Or, are people kind of despondent? Are we in this place of complacency and, blissful ignorance?
So it's funny because right before here, I was having a conversation with our friend Nicole Hannah Jones.
1619 Project, also another amazing.
And I was asking her, do you think it is possible to write a book that tells the truth about America and have it well received? And her answer was like, I don't know if that's possible. Not if it's from the perspective of black people. But what we don't understand is that all that stuff, you know, the mythology of America. What we really never talk about is that, so the black study, the idea of black studies and the black history courses is a fairly new idea, right? It was, the black studies movement started in the late 60s, early 70s. So when I went to school, I was taught by the first generation of white people who had anything in their history about black history. So one of the things that we have to understand is that the myth and the pushback is partly due to white people do not know history. Like they did not learn about black people in history. So the myth that they've been told, they really believe it because the one that they're teaching today was taught to them by people who was taught by people who knew nothing about most of the stuff in this book. But they also live in a country where they never really hear that they are wrong. Like white people rarely are blatantly told, I mean, that's just, that you're wrong, right? But especially by somebody who doesn't look like them. They almost never hear that. So that's part of that pushback, right? And so when you sit down to write a book, you know, anybody who works in a black public-facing space knows that if you tell the truth as a black person and in any place or any platform where white people can see you, you're going to receive hate and backlash.
I have a testimony.
And so part of it is what, you know, I laugh when Nicole said, and because we've heard it all so many times, when white people get mad, you kind of know you're on the right track, like you're doing your job, right? Like if everybody said, this is a wonderful book and it should be accepted everywhere, then it was probably not a good book.
Yeah.
Like I probably didn't write it. So that's the answer to that.
Well, you know, I have to say, I think so many of us, we grow up in homes where you get your public education, you go to school, you learn what's in the books, and then there's always that secondary education that you have to give black children. Some would argue this is why Brown v. Board wasn't necessarily a good thing. You put the minds of innocent black children in the hands of white women who did not look at them as human,
right.
You know? That really changed our psyche. But I have to say, I considered myself a well-read person and cultured, and I know a lot of things. I know a little about a lot. Reading this book, 90% of the things I probably didn't know. It was, and you know, unfortunately for Michael, fortunately for me, I have his cell phone number, so I can text him every time, like, what? This is crazy. I'm screenshotting the book, like, what? Did you know this? Like, yeah, I wrote it. But some of the things that you unearth are mind-boggling. So I'm curious, what was your research like? Are these things that you, like knowledge you acquired through the years, or when you set out to write this book, was it like a journey of discovery of America? And what were you surprised to learn on this journey as you were doing this research?
So it was a little bit of both, a journey of discovery, but a lot of it I knew. So I worked with a historian who has a book out, fairly new. I think it came out 2 weeks before mine, called Black Folk, about working class black America. Blair Kelly. She is the distinguished professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina. And she was the head of Dean of Africana Studies when I was writing the book. So what we did, we got together and we imagined this book. If you've had it earlier before today, then you see it's formulated like a textbook. So we imagined a syllabus and a curriculum and said, this is what we're going to cover, this is what we're going to cover, this is what we're going to cover. And a lot of it was stuff that I think you can tell when I'm in my bag, like, yo, Mike, like when I talk about rice, right? There's a whole chapter predicated on like what you think, what you know about America and how rice and just Africans knowing the horticulture and the agriculture of rice created the economic system that was America's first edible cash crop. Well, I think a lot of that stuff that I was already interested in, right? And I already knew some. And then there's stuff that I discovered along the way. For instance, Moses Dixon. And the idea that there was a secret society of 12 men all across the southern states who were planning a national slave revolt. And the only thing that stopped them was the Civil War broke out. And they went on to have one of the first and biggest fraternal organizations that they used the dues to build the first black-owned hospital, the Taborian Hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And like how many of the civil rights leaders were tied to that hospital, were born there, were trained there in this little all-black town. Stuff like that I learned researching the book. And then Blair was always like, well, you know, you got to talk about this, like the whole, I'd always planned to do a chapter on religion, but she kind of told me that and showed me the integral part of the AME church, which I'd known a little bit about, but she taught me and directed me into more research about it. So it was both a process of learning and getting off some of the stuff that I already knew.
Well, you did it beautifully, truly. You know, another thing that I love about your writing style, and if you guys followed Michael on Twitter or X or whatever this foolish man is calling this now, the way that you weave stories. And so you tell a story about, he tells a story about his coat, his goose down, getting stolen. And so the whole time, you can read this and like, okay, is this a biography? Like, I'm not sure. But if you know his writing style, you're like, how's he gonna tie it together? It's so exciting, you know? So reading these stories, it's very accessible because it's applicable. You make it very relatable. I don't even know if you can answer this question, but I'm just so curious how you're able to do that. Because that's kind of what you're known for. Your threads, you make you write this book in a way that it is comprehensible, you know, and digestible, like I said. So I'm just curious how you apply these, like, every pieces of our lives, daily pieces of our lives, to these big, huge points.
I think, one, if I have like any kind of talent, it is the ability to explain things. And I also think a lot in analogies. Like, how do you explain a concept and distill it where, people will understand it? Which is interesting because when you say, how do I do that? I'd never thought about how I did it. I think it's just how I think. I was in the middle of an argument, like an ongoing argument between two of my friends, Toure in Panama today, and we were talking about Taylor Swift. And I asked them, like, so Taylor Swift is is white people's who?
Good question. Taylor
And I asked,
white people's who?
and then I answered him, I think it is Erykah Badu.
Say more.
Because so think about this, right? So I don't know if I've ever heard a whole Taylor Swift song.
I couldn't name.
Right? Like, where would I even hear a Taylor Swift song as a black person in the wild? Like, you know, I could, like, just like, but, I know about Taylor Swift. I just know, like, who she's dating and all that, but I don't know anything about Taylor Swift's music.
Yeah.
I know that Taylor Swift is really popular. And that's the same way, like, there's a generation of black women especially who love Erykah Badu like white people, like white girls love Taylor Swift.
Okay.
And, like, the white people might not even, they know there's a singer called Erykah Badu, and they might know one song. But, so then I go on and say, I go and tell them, well, you know, if, say you never had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and like by the time you're, I don't know, 25, if you ain't never had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you're intentionally trying not to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like if you don't think it's nasty or anything, you're just intentionally trying not.
Yeah.
So I admit, yeah, I'm intentionally trying not to listen to it. I know how to get a Taylor Swift song,
Yeah.
but I just intentionally don't listen to Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Like I never heard a Pitbull song, I don't think, and I ain't never been to a monster truck rally or a burlesque show or any of those things. I probably had opportunity to go, and it's fascinating to me how we can live in the same world, and she is so important to some people and nothing to me.
Yeah.
And Erykah Badu is so important to us and nothing to some
True.
people.
Yeah.
And that's why Taylor Swift is white people's Erykah Badu.
Wow. Yeah, and there you get it. Now I get it.
And so I don't know, like, and when I finished, they was like, damn, you wrapped that up nice. And I was like, yeah, I had no idea where I was going when I started. I was just
the brilliance of Michael Harriot. If you don't know who Erykah Badu is, you better call Tyrone. That was really good, Mike. I love that. I think about some of these discussions we have amongst ourselves and even in spaces like this. And I think so many of us in our own way, we live in service to black folks. We live in service to the equality and liberation of black folks, because when that happens, everybody benefits. That's not our intention. It's not like we're working against that, but sometimes there's this attitude of like, black people will save us. And it's like, we're saving ourselves and you just kind of benefit from it. When it comes to this book, I'm curious, because you've done a great job of laying out history and identifying so many lies. When it comes to looking ahead, is the equality and liberation of black folks possible in this country?
I think it is possible because, first of all, when you look at what black people, like the black people in this room, would have seemed like an impossibility to our grandparents, right? And I think the other thing is just being black is a process of imagining impossibility, right? Like, I would imagine that an enslaved person would have thought that it was impossible that we was going to shoot people until we were free, right? Like, that was what the Civil War, like, we had a whole war, and it was going to be a national war and the bloodiest war in the history of the continent until we were free. They would have imagined, and then the generation after them would have imagined that, like, you could just wake up in the morning and go vote without seeing a white person shooting at you and not risking your life to do it. That would have seemed like an impossibility.
Well, barely in Georgia until recently, but sure.
Yeah, I mean, unless you had some water.
Right, exactly.
But that's part of it. And the other thing is, when you look at what has been done to black people, there's nothing that has ever been done to a human being on the face of the earth that hasn't been inflicted on black people en masse. All the violence, all the terrorism, all the injustice, every way that you can think of to extinguish black people, people's identity, their existence has been done to black people en masse. The lynching, the terrorism, the massacres. And it did not work. And the idea, like, it is not like I'm saying like black people are indestructible, because don't be trying that shit, y'all. But it is also that, I don't know if it is because of the resilience of black people or the incompetence of white people, because all of the ideas that they came up with, like, they've been very incompetent at stopping black people from doing whatever we wanted to do. They could not stop us from freeing ourselves. They could not stop us from escaping. They could not stop us from going to their schools. They could not stop us from taking control of our politics and our destiny. And like all of the things that we made up our mind to do, we have done, right? And it have been at most speed bumps. And so is the equality and the liberation of black people possible? If we want it, they can't really stop us.
That's a word. Definitely. I do want to let you guys know we want this to be an interactive conversation. So if you have questions, I think I will invite you to this microphone here. I will continue with our conversation. But as you have questions, if you line up here, I will call on you. And if I can just take a moment of personal privilege and shout out somebody in the audience. Ms. Alicia Garza is here, the founder of Black Lives Matter. Please stand, Alicia, so we can acknowledge you. She runs Black Futures Lab and was one of the 3 original founders of Black Lives Matter and is doing amazing work across the country. So thank you, my sister, for being here. So I'll continue with you, Michael. So you say it is possible, and you talk about all the things that we've gone through. I wonder, we are Black Americans, we are a small percentage of the global population, yet everything we do, the rest of the world follows. Why?
Well, because first of all, I think when you think about, again, if I was anywhere in the world, and whether I was a kid and wanted to see a superhero, or a person who wanted to believe in a religion, or a person who just wanted to see something good, you think about this, right? Black people came to this country with nothing. I'm not saying nothing like not a lot of money, nothing. Not a language, not anybody who loved them. And the purpose for being brought here was to extract every ounce of labor and intellectual property from them, and then for them to die, right? And to see what we've built, the institutions, the families, the communities, the art, the culture, what y'all talking, when we talking about American, is really stuff that black people created, right? Like American food ain't nothing but black people food. Like they talking about fried chicken, right? When they talk about American music, they talking about black people music. When they talk about dance like in America, they talk about dance like black people. When you think about that, and you juxtapose it with like what I said, like there is nothing that has ever been done to a people, that's really the greatest story in the history of the known world. There's nothing that has been done to anybody on this planet that hasn't been done to the black people in America. And not only we survived it, we did all that stuff I just said. And so if I were not a black American, I would say, God damn, them some bad motherfuckers. Like, I kind of want to be like that too, right? And so I think that's partly why. And that is absent of the fact that, again, they don't know most of the stuff that was done to us and that we survived and that we've done, right? So just looking at it, when you think about the universal struggle of man to want love, to want to survive, to see the oppressed triumph over the powerful, black people did all of that. It's like a universal story. And that story is embedded, like that story is part of why black Americans are seen in that light.
Yeah. Wow. Another thing that happens, or that you write about in the book that I think is so important, because I think to your point, when our story is told in history, it is only told after we arrive in America. And so you might be under the impression that we had no existence until we were kidnapped and brought here. You make a point of telling stories from the continent, of our ancestors. And most of these stories, I'll be honest with you all, I did not know. Reading those stories, when I first got the book, I skipped ahead and I opened to like the middle of the book and read one of the stories. And it's a interstitial called King of Queens. Mm-hmm. And I read this and I'm like, that Michael Harriot is so clever. This story sounds like true. Like, I wonder where he got this like fiction from. He should write like a scripted series. And then only to discover these are all true stories of people in history that we just never learn. What was your point in including stories from the continent that can resonate with so many of us today?
So part of it is to show, like, again, to start our history in America kind of negates a large part of our history and our culture, and it says, and it also makes the point that, like, when you start with black people's arrival in America, what you're saying is our history is predicated on something that white people did to us. And, like, again, what we brought to this country to build this country started before there was a this country. And so that was the important part. And then the other part is the idea of this global community, because when we talk about like is a black person in America, right? Like, does that only include the black people who were enslaved in this continent? Because, like, what's the difference between the black people who were enslaved by the British in this continent and Jamaica, for instance? What's the difference between the black people who were enslaved in the part of this continent that was controlled by America versus, like, the people from New Orleans who were enslaved by the French, who they technically weren't American descendants of slaves? Like, all of that is predicated on some arbitrary lines and history and dates that white people injected into the story. And what I wanted to say is, like, the geography kind of doesn't matter, and the dates kind of don't matter, and it definitely starts before white people were introduced into our world, and it extends beyond the actions of white people.
Well, you did that beautifully as well. You brought up something that I think is interesting, because we've had this conversation in the community, especially around reparations. I mean, listen, if this commission is ever formed to study reparations, please, Black AF history should be the guiding post for reparations. But there is this discussion of the American descendant. Yeah. I think the point you made is so important, because the institution and oppression that existed extends to a lot of people, and a lot of people don't know that. That this was not the only place that there were people who were enslaved. You tell a story, I don't think this is in the book. This is a story that you told me, and I wonder if you would mind sharing it with the audience, about a group of Black Americans who were enslaved, who just refused to be enslaved, and they fled and built community all across the globe.
Yeah, this is a conversation we had about, so one of the things, and that's part of the previous question you asked about these communities that I talked about. So one of the premises is that there is an African-American diaspora that we don't ever talk about. We talk about the African diaspora, people from Africa who are spread across the world, but there is a diaspora across the world that has roots in American Black people. So, The Rock, for instance, right? So The Rock is a grandson of people who are black Nova Scotians. Those were people who fought for the British in the American Revolution. And when they asked what they want, what the British asked them what they wanted, they said, well, we want to get the hell out of here. And so there are black communities in Nova Scotia and Canada that were created for black people. The reason the Bahamas is black, like we think of it as like, when they started colonizing the Caribbean, but most of the black people in the Bahamas are descendants of people who were enslaved, who after the American Revolution, the British loyalists left and went to the Bahamas. And then a lot of the people who were spread across the Caribbean were people who fought in various wars for the British Empire and were left, like the Charleston Dragoons, right? They were a group of people who, from Charleston, South Carolina, who fought for the British, and then they were put in the British Navy, and all of those British territories in the Caribbean, they basically, because, within a few years, the British had outlawed slavery. So these people were stationed all around the Caribbean, capturing slave ships. You could read about the story of the Creole. And that diaspora extends to South America, Mexico, the communities in Mexico, and there were some in America, right? You can read about the Great Dismal Swamp, an area between North Carolina and Virginia, who they think hundreds of thousands of enslaved people lived in. So there is an African-American diaspora around the globe of people who were descendants of American enslaved. And so back to your original question about reparations, because we always say reparations as if it was, like it implies, almost now assumes that it is limited. We're talking about reparations for slavery, right? When we say reparations. Now think about this. This is an argument that's an entire chapter in the book. Okay, we know slavery was constitutional, right? So after emancipation, black people were citizens, they were employed, they were taxpayers, they paid for schools that their children couldn't attend, they paid for colleges they funded the college. Their tax dollars funded the colleges that gave opportunity to white people. They couldn't attend those colleges. The example that I use in the book is in South Carolina, which was a majority black state until the 1940 census, right? And so the majority of black people were funding the economic generational wealth of white people, right? And so South Carolina filed the first case that became Brown versus Board, and I could go into the history because that my family still is upset that it's the name of that case is Brown versus Board when it started in South Carolina. But it started in a community that was 75% black. The children sometimes drowned on the way to school because they had to cross a river. And they asked for one bus in a school district they were paying for. That was 75% black, so it was 75% funded off their tax dollars. And the interesting thing about this community is that they had a paper plant, so most of the black employment rate was higher than the white employment rate. Well, when the Supreme Court eventually ruled that segregation was illegal, what they said is all of that stuff that we had been doing, all that theft, because they've been stealing from the black people to give to the white people. When they took that money, the Supreme Court said that was illegal, but they did not repair the harm, right? So when that case was decided, in a majority black state, the segregated schools, the schools that black children attended, were worth about $13 billion combined. The white schools were worth about $65 billion. That was black people's money, y'all, right? And nobody ever paid them back. So my mama, my grandmother, my great-grandparents, all of the money, all of the stuff that they worked for, their wealth was taken and given to people. They invested something into this country that they never received. That doesn't even include the GI Bill. That doesn't include the New Deal, the federal tax dollars. when we talk about reparations, we talk about slavery and none of that, right? Like that is calculable. We don't have to guesstimate it about what it would have made per hour. We can just say, this is how much tax. I could go to the census right now and pull up the amount of tax dollars that all the black people paid in this country and say, we want that money back, y'all. But we don't talk about that. So it is a complex question, but we have to start with, what you mean when you say reparations? You talking about the slavery or the stuff that was after slavery? You talking about the stuff that all the white people already said, what y'all were doing was wrong. We don't even have to litigate that part because the Supreme Court already said it. But how did you repair it?
Let's go make that argument together. I mean, honestly, because, Michael, when we are all in a group chat, I will say, it's a collective of us who are, write or in television or whatever, and Michael comes with these kind of stories, and, he'll say, oh, yeah, like he'll break something down like that, and he'll just say casually, yeah, you guys know I have a master's in, like, macroeconomics, right? We're like, no? Like, who knew that? So he does these history lessons all the time. We all know something, and like I know a little something. You walk around with this wealth of knowledge, and this is a sincere question. It sounds funny, but I'm actually being sincere. How do you walk around with that wealth of knowledge and not be utterly pissed off every day, all day? Because so much of what you describe is prevalent in our schools today. When we go into inner city neighborhoods and every day it says your life doesn't matter. You go to a dilapidated school, we don't care about you. These homes we're letting crumble. We literally cannot gentrify a neighborhood. If you got all of us together and we moved, you're not going to see Banana Republic popping up and Starbucks popping up. It takes white dollars to improve a neighborhood. Realizing that and seeing that and being confronted with that, I just wonder how you are not... I think the young lady who said during the George Floyd, like, all we want is whatever, like we want peace, we don't want revenge or something. How do you have that wealth of knowledge and still live peacefully, make us laugh, write beautifully, be a kind person, all those things?
So I don't think, first of all, I don't know if knowing more, like, do you know a black person who knows even what they know and isn't, don't think of the inequality of this world? Like, we know that this inequality exists, so, like, knowing more doesn't make you more, I don't know if it can make you more angry. You just have more stuff to be angry about. But I think that the other thing is all of that stuff you're talking about is juxtaposed by knowing what black people did and what we can do, right? Like, it ain't, like, spend very little time thinking about white people. So I can't really get mad. I know what black people can do. Now, when people think, well, why are you always talking about white people? As a journalist, as a journalist. And I don't even think people know how much this world avoids talking about white people. So one of the first lessons you'll learn in journalism is writing in active voice. So when the example probably every journalism student has learned, it'll say, well, when you write something about a police, don't say Michael Harriot was arrested last night. You say the police, Atlanta Police Department arrested Michael Harriot last night, because it gives the person, it makes it active. It tells you more information. Now you know that the Atlanta Police Department was involved, what he did, so that passive voice. But the only exception for that we see constantly is when it's white people. So we say, we talk about history. Black people were enslaved. Mm-hmm. Black people suffered through black people experienced injustice. And so when people notice that I say white people, it's because I'm talking about history in the same way we talk about every other thing, same way we talk about a police report. Yeah. the white people did this, right?
Yes.
The white people, like it's a police report.
Yeah.
And so when I say that sentence in the book, right, like the only difference between a colonizer and a burglar is who writes the police report, right? When you write, who writes the police report really matters. Because you can leave out the white people and include like black people were oppressed, black people experienced tragedy. And when you don't say who did it, you, I think, perpetuate the injustice and the violence and the cruelty because it excuses the people who did it.
Absolutely. And I can testify, in newsrooms, you know this, in newsrooms, you always want to, you can be unbiased. That's the goal of newsrooms. But so often unbiased centers a white man, a white man's voice. I see we have a question, maybe perhaps a young question.
Sure.
But before we get to your question, I just want to say your T-shirt says, "Those preventing history from being taught intend to repeat it." So please go ahead with your question.
And he's not going to ask a question, he just has to go to the bathroom, so
Okay.
we'll take care of him in a second. Yeah, we're in trouble in public school. I mean, in Georgia, I didn't even realize how in trouble we are in Georgia. So in your research, are there precedences for how to get out of the fog of thinking that public school is doing any kind of job to educate kids and remedy that? Meaning, we'll do what we have to do in the schools, we'll fight that as much as we can, but it seems like we got to reinstitute some things outside of school that maybe we haven't been doing for a while because we've been trusting the public schools to do something. What kinds of things can we do on Saturdays and after school to create that education?
So one is, and this is going to sound like really like plain and simple, but listen to black people. Like, now, I'm not saying that like as a performative thing, right? But 50 years ago, we didn't even think about the concept that it's hard to learn when you're hungry. And some guys in Chicago were saying, hey, we're going to feed the kids before they go to school. And now that's like a thing at every school. Like they have free breakfast at schools because it makes it easier to learn, right? And what they did is they listened to black people, like the very people they were denigrating, they listened to. When we think about...
Well, for those who don't know,
we're talking about the Black Panthers free breakfast free program. And there are so many examples of that throughout history. The idea of, like, my generation was the first generation to have all-day kindergarten because black people said, like, we're paying for schools and we're paying for daycare. Yep. And so the full-day kindergarten is a black invention. Universal health care. Like, it's crazy. Like, when you asked that question earlier about the impossibility, so the next generation of children will probably think it was crazy that, like, you could die because you ain't have enough money to see a doctor. Because we have health care now, and that's, like, not even a generation old, right? And the thing, like, we don't get these ideas out of the ether. A lot of them are stuff that black people have been saying. Look at this is a perfect historical example. Do me a favor, like not now, but go look at the 1984 platform for Jesse Jackson. This is what he said. LGBTQ rights. He said, we're going to I'm going to fight for universal health care. We want to fight for we want to stop taxing the middle class and tax the wealthy. We want to stop like all of the stuff that is like the mainstream democratic, and not even democratic, like mainstream political ideas now. black people were pushing those ideas 40 years ago, and they were radical, right? Like, even the idea of, like, instead of locking people up for drugs, why don't we have, like, drug treatment centers? Yeah. Why don't we legalize marijuana? These were ideas that, well, we were trying to implement for 40 years, and the same is true in the education system, the same is true in the criminal justice system. And we don't have to have any, like, brainstorming session. We talked about it, we recognized Alicia Garza, right? Like, when we had this whole discussion about, like, Ice Cube and this black agenda, bro, we got a black agenda.
Right.
Like that black, like we have at the biggest survey of black people in the history of the world and say, this is the thing that black people want. Like, she did that. Yes, she did that. And it's on a piece of paper, and we did it in, like, 1972. Yeah. Like, there's always been a black agenda. We don't even have to redo that part or relitigate all of these things. All we got to do is listen to black people.
Yeah. Another interesting campaign happening in 1984, where there was a very white conservative politician saying we should make America great again, whose policies were just as awful and clumsy and terrible and harmful to black folks. And people think Donald Trump turned the Republican Party racist. It's the only party we know.
And it's interesting because if you have, so she's talking about Ronald Reagan, and the book starts off on the night that Ronald Reagan was elected, and me saying, oh shit, we're going back to slavery.
He literally cries in the book. It's a hilarious story.
Yeah. So, again, history repeats itself again, just like its shirt says, the people who trying to prevent it intend to repeat it.
Yes, sir.
All right. I'll try to be quick. Like, a couple things. Like, no one does this the way you do it. Like, the way you connect the culture, you tell the stories, the church stories, the questions in the book about the church. I had my wife dying laughing in the airport about that. Like, nobody does this, and I followed you for a minute because of that. So thank you so much. I want to thank you for reading the audio book because it's your work, your voice that comes through. Uncle, the racist baby, the uncle. That you can't get that if somebody else were to read it. My question though, like, I followed you for a minute, and I absolutely like Isabel Wilkerson. Right? And I got the audio book. I also have the physical copy, like required reading. But like, I watch you on social media, and you have this, dare I say, reckless abandon, like that I love, because the white people, God, that's just the most brilliant stuff I've ever heard in my life. WIPIPO. At what point, and how and why did you just say, here I am, I'm a black man, and I'm gonna speak my truth, no matter how you feel, F your feelings. Because, you know, like, I think it, I feel it, but I got a job. And, you know, and I love Fidelity Investments, which is where I work, right? But I feel it, it's just a boldness, man. Like, I almost feel like I live through your freedom, and I don't know.
So I think part of that story is in the book. So I was homeschooled, so I never learned the deference to whiteness, the subconscious deference to whiteness that most people have, right? So I don't know how, like, I don't walk around snarling at white people, right? But if, like, I just talk to them like how I talk to Tiffany, and it seems like freedom, because we have been schooled into deferring to whiteness as, like, I hear it all the time, you know, this is what white people do with their money. White people don't do nothing, know nothing about finance more than anybody else. They just, you know, are privileged enough to be part of a system that was constructed for their benefit. right? Like, you don't have to know a bunch of stuff. As a matter of fact, you get to know less stuff and succeed more, right? But I think this book looks at the world objectively through a lens that doesn't have the white filter, and that seems, the idea that it's radical is radical to me. Like, somebody was saying a couple of days ago, man, I know it's not gonna happen, but it would be crazy if this book was taught in schools. And I was like, yeah, I agree with them. I agree that it's not gonna happen, right? But think about that. There's not a curse word in the book, right? The only violence in the book is the stuff that people actually did. So what you're saying, and I agree with them again, is that there is no way we're going to teach the real history and the truth that is more accurate than the stuff that we already learned. There's no way we're going to do that. You must be fucking out of your mind. Like, that, to me, that's radical.
Thank you.
Hey, I want to be, let you know, like, I ain't a homeschool advocate either, man. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that I think school benefits from, just like the social. I was an awkward, weird dude, man. So, yeah, I'm not just saying, like, everybody homeschool their kids.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, first, I want to say thank you also, not just for the book, but for the work that you do as a commentator on MSNBC, that it really does bring a dynamic that is missing in a lot of news programs. So thank you for that. So at the beginning, Tiffany asked about who you wrote this for. And I want to take that a step further and say, so after reading the book, what do you want people to take out of this and move forward with?
So I think that story of, I think I got to tell the greatest story of the greatest thing that ever happened. And one of the things that I think this book can do is not like give you pride and give you a knowledge of self. Like, you can sit on the toilet and just, like, the characters and the people and the stories, to me, it's part of it was an exercise in storytelling. And it's just getting to tell a story where, like, it's almost, I'll be honest, it's almost cheating, because black people are so fucking great that I didn't even have to make up a story. Like, all I had to do is use my words, right? Like, it's almost cheating. And so what I want people to take from it is, like, all of the stuff that we did, I just put the words on paper. Like, I really I don't consider that I did anything extraordinary, except, ooh, y'all ever heard this? Like, even when I'm on Twitter, that's what, ooh, y'all ever heard this story about these dudes that, like the story to me of, like, Esteban, like a cross-country epic. That is a fucking great story. I do not know, like, how we don't tell every kid about that when we talk about, even if we start with black people in America. How do we not tell that great of a story, right? Like, how do we not tell, like, every time we eat a donut, you know who brought that shit to America? Dude named Juan Garrido, right? Like, I just had to write it on paper.
Yeah.
Okay,
You
thank
did
you.
so brilliantly. We're going to close it out with these last two questions. So, yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for being here and for writing and for sharing and for continuing the art of storytelling and telling the truth and telling black history when we know what time it is and people don't like the truth and they definitely don't like black history. So my question is, I came over here from the event at the King Center. If people don't know, Mother Fletcher was over there. She's the oldest known survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. Yes, go get your books. They're over there. She's signing them. And so coming from that event to this one, it has me thinking, on Auburn Avenue, black history, this is living, right? Literally living. She's here. She's the oldest living author in America. Learned a lot. What do we do? Because we talked about the public education system. We know that's not going to do nothing. We've talked about homeschooling. We better homeschool our kids because they're going to be doomed if we don't. Like, we have to start doing something different. So I'm just thinking from your perspective, after reading and researching and writing this history, how do we live it and breathe it? Because I'm from Atlanta, so I have a different perspective on things in the sense of, right, like I was privileged to grow up around this and to kind of have that kind of same perspective, right? On, like, my mayor has always been black. My teachers have always been black. You know, my doctors have always been black. So we have Stonecrest. We have communities where that have been all black. This is also the anniversary of the 1906 massacre in Atlanta, our Tulsa. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, you know, we can build our own communities, we can educate our own kids, like, we don't have to work for the white man, like, we can own our own media companies, like, we really can do this, and we've been doing it, and we are continuing to do it, but how do we live it? How do we really live it? That's what I'm kind of wrestling with.
So what you're talking about is something that like, one of the things that is important about knowing about history is whenever the conversation comes up about what black people need to do, it's all stuff that black people already did, right? Like, black people built their own communities and had their own businesses and owned colleges, and white people burned, like, whatever we do, white people try to burn it down. So the question is, what do white people need to do? Because we have done all the things that we have ever needed to do, right? And so I think, again, we don't have to imagine new things. Knowing history, we're like, oh yeah, we did all the things that there are to do. We can keep doing those things and keep trying to do those things. But somebody's gonna come burn it down unless America changes, right? And so, like, that is the last chapter of the book, you know, talks about the idea of there is nothing wrong with black people, there is something wrong with America. And again, when you list all of those things, you list stuff that black people did in math. We need to, you know, have our own business. We did that. We need to have our own schools. We did that. Like, the constant refrain that I always hear is about, you know, if black people just concentrated on education. You know, like, we came here again, we couldn't read, or we couldn't even speak the language. And literally within 15 years, they had to make it illegal for us to read because we did it so well. And they said, we will kill you if you keep doing that. And we still kept doing it. And then when we emancipated ourselves, we built our own schools, right? And they burned them down. We created our own newspapers, right? One of the things that is interesting about writing this book, you asked me something. So one of the things I wanted to do was just not go into, like, tell what I think about this event in history, but to go and look at what black people at the time were thinking about it. And I knew that there were black newspapers at the time. And I'd always run into the same two sentences: burned by a white mob, no surviving copies exist. And if you go to a HBCU, there's always a building on that campus that was, like, built in 1838. And then they'll say, but this current structure was built in, like, 1904 after it was burned down. So all of the stuff that we did that, and then we said, like, after Jim Crow, we said, hey, to get equal education, we will let them spit in our kids' face and threaten their lives. And so still to this day, there's never been a nanosecond in the history of this country where most black people have had access to an equal education. So what are you talking about when you say black people need to value education? And that narrative, again, all the stuff that black people need, I don't have to come up with ideas of what black people need to do, because we have done all of it. And that's the importance of history. Knowing that, oh yeah, we ain't gotta come up with no new shit. Like, we just gotta keep doing what black people do, and white people gotta stop doing that thing that they do. And that is how we solve the problem.
Miss Alicia Garza.
You better, Michael. Well, first, I just want to say thank you for loving us. Thank you for loving us enough to teach us not just about how we've been talked about, but teach us about what we've been and what we can continue to be and what we are right now. That's important to me. And I'm reading your book right now, and I read a story every night before I go to bed, and I have the best dreams. I have the best dreams. My question for you, Michael, is we have an election coming up. And we know that throughout history, Black people have also really determined what democracy can be in this country. We fought for that. And so I guess my question is, what can Black as Fuck history teach us about what we might need to be thinking about as we move into another pivotal election year?
I think one of the things, and we've had this conversation, is the way media and even social media works is sometimes voices that are anti-Black inside our community are elevated to create a narrative that doesn't exist. Like, remember when they said, like, you know, what are Black men gonna do with why are Black men supporting Stacey Abrams? And then, because Stacey Abrams, I think all Black men support Stacey Abrams. But, and then, like, the numbers came out, and then it was like Black men supported Stacey Abrams at the same rate that, you know, black women has, you know, and that the little small distinction was distinction that we see in every election because of, you know, felony disenfranchisement, and the arbitrary rules of voting. But you're going to hear, for instance, you know, somebody tweeted today about, you know, Trump said something about he's going to have a massive deportation effort. And, you know, one of those anti-immigrant groups said, yeah, I'm starting to like Trump more and more. The same people who we always talking about, you know, the Democratic Party can tell Black folks anything and they'll buy it. They buying Trump shit, right? And so one thing that we can learn is that, again, we don't need any new answers. Like, why do we listen to, why do we elevate these? It's always an arbitrary Negro voice like a Candace Owens or a Jason Whitlock who don't have any scholar. When we got thousands of scholars who've been on the work, who created like who asked more Black people than anybody else in the history of America what they wanted. And we always get the same answers. And then we see the opposition saying, yeah, but if Black, because what the essence of their arguments is Black people are too dumb, white people know what's better for Black people than Black people. That's the essence of the argument. Because when 85 to 90% of Black people say one thing and you elevating a small minority of people, again, the point of that is not education. Because when you educate somebody, you telling them, like, you can tell a kid somewhere in this world there are birds who bark, right? But when you tell them that dogs bark, you're educating them. When you tell them that birds bark sometimes and there are cats who don't meow and they bark sometimes, I'm sure there's a species that does that, but you are miseducating them by saying this is the thing that is equal to the thing that is most true, right? And that miseducation is essential because we all know somebody like that, but there's so very few of those Black people who believe that thing. And that is what we got to take and understand when we hear these. Like, there ain't two sides to. I trust Black people, and I do not believe that I'm smarter than my grandmama who read the newspaper every day, and Black women, and most Black voters, and the Black scholars, and the Black people who are out there on the ground, and the Black people who are in the poor communities, and the teachers, and all of those people, versus some nigga on Twitter, right? And so I think those are the two things that we have to understand when we're talking about black people. We smart enough to know what we need. I think they did. Yeah, I think they did.
Too?
Yeah, you.
We shut it down, you guys. That's okay. I got a little bad speaker in me so I can project. I want to thank you guys for coming out. Michael, I just want to thank you for your body of work. Not just with this book, but your entire body of work. I consider it such a privilege to know you. I am so honored that I get to be a fan and a friend. And I share in that sentiment, I'm sure, with a lot of folks who came out to hear you tonight. This book is so necessary. It is so necessary. Have your children read it. Have your friends and family read it. You know, when people say, oh, you argue about politics at Thanksgiving, I'm like, that is white people stuff. Like, we don't typically do that. White people, when you have relatives saying ignorant things, have them read this book. Get in front of the problem. Everybody collectively do our part, because if we all do a little, no one has to do a lot. And we can collectively achieve the equality and liberation of black folks that you told us is definitely possible. So thank you, my brother. Thank you.